So on today's guest, we have Dr. Philip Vieira. Did I pronounce that right? Vieira?
Vieira, yeah, that's
Cool.
good.
Yeah. So he's a professor here at Cal State Dominguez Hills. His research interest includes pharmacokinetics, neuroplasticity, I believe, right? And what else did we say?
Well, it's a lot of work with addiction, right?
Right,
Exactly.
right, drug addiction.
Addiction, behavior.
That's right.
And that how that affects our own behavior, correct? Yeah. But I wanted to start off just by having you explain in your own words what all this means for those of us at home that, aren't too familiar with the terminology.
Yeah, sure. My research has gone a few different directions, and we'll probably get more into the details of my academic trajectory. But lately, the stuff I've been involved with fits under the umbrella of drug addiction and how the brain is involved with drug addiction. So the types of questions I try to pursue have to do with, during different stages of addiction or different processes of addiction, how is the brain changing? How is the brain supporting that kind of behavior? What parts of the brain and circuits of the brain are being utilized by these drugs of abuse that have fueled this huge epidemic that we see right now.
Right.
So that's kind of the general direction my research goes. And then within that, I parse out kind of separate detailed questions. One has to do with, as you mentioned before, pharmacokinetics. And basically all that means is how does your body metabolize drugs, or what is the fate of a drug after you take it in your body? That all depends on how you take the drug. It can depend on lots of different factors, like whether you've eaten that day, whether you have experience with that drug, genetic factors that play into that.
Right.
So what is your body doing to a drug after you take it? So that's one direction I go. I also look at more specific circuits in the brain and proteins that may be involved in supporting this kind of behavior.
Right.
Really, the ultimate end goal, I guess you could say, is to kind of better understand how addiction works in hopes to better treat it.
Right. And each of our bodies reacts differently, right? We all have a different reaction. We're not all going to react exactly the same way. Correct?
Exactly, yeah. And probably people at home know, like anecdotally, if you try a drug, experiment with different drugs, and your friends are around and they're all trying it, different people will have different reactions,
right.
And it can be very context dependent. So if you're, doing drugs in your bedroom or in your backyard or, behind the classroom or something, like a lot of those factors can affect how the drug, how your body impacts the drug after taking it.
Right, right. And before we get on to more in detail, I kind of want to just, where did you grow up? Like, how did you develop an interest in psychology in general?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a native-born Californian, and grew up in the Central Valley for the most part of California. So that's up kind of Fresno, Merced area.
Okay.
And of course, like that area is very well known for a drug epidemic itself. But at that time, I didn't really have a lot of interest in drug addiction. I've always been pretty purist when it comes to my own personal consumption. So at least through high school and growing up, I never wanted to have anything to do with that stuff.
Yeah.
But I didn't judge anyone who did, and you can tell by the way I look. A lot of people would approach me in the streets like, "Hey, man, do you smoke weed?" And stuff. I'm like, no. But
I can see that.
my friends were involved in that kind of culture, and I had a good time just hanging out with them, and I was often the designated driver.
Right.
But no, really, the roots of my interest in psychology, I would say, are more founded on language. How humans learn languages, how the brain supports different languages. And that all kind of grew out of, first growing up in kind of an immigrant, multi-language family. So my parents are immigrants from the Azores, which are a group of islands that belong to Portugal, or are part of Portugal. So they immigrated to California in around 1970s, and that's where I was born, and growing up in that kind of household, you hear Portuguese being spoken at home, but also English and English in the classroom, and so that was kind of the seed for that. After I graduated high school, I decided to take some time off and live abroad, and that's where it really sparked my interest in different languages. So I lived over in the Czech Republic for a year and started learning the Czech language, and very, very different, obviously, from a Romance language like Portuguese or a Germanic language like English. So I was learning all these different languages, lived in Germany, lived in Portugal for a little while, and that was really the spark of my interest in how the brain works, how human cognition works, and how the human body, particularly the brain, supports these kind of complex things like learning languages. So after doing that for a few years, I thought maybe I'll try to take a class on this at some point, and that's kind of where it started.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds more like you would have gone into like linguistics or something rather than what
Yeah.
you're doing now, where it's addiction.
Yeah. So that was kind of one of the first turning points in my academic career. After learning about the languages themselves, but also kind of reading up on how the brain learns languages, I enrolled at Fresno State University, which is up there in Fresno, our sister campus, and I decided I'll take a class on linguistics. Let's see where this goes. And it turned out linguistics, the study of linguistics, can be very kind of mathematical and formulaic, and I was much less interested in that side of things. So after taking that class, I kind of moved more in the direction of the psychology of language learning and the kind of developmental side of the brain. And we always hear about these developmental periods where children can learn languages really easily. And so that was one kind of turning point where I moved away from linguistics more towards psychology. And primarily that was due to having a professor who became my mentor in undergrad, and he really encouraged me to look more into the field of biological psychology. So we had a good relationship together, working in his lab and helping him kind of put things together and study the brain. And so that was when I moved away from linguistics and more towards psychology.
Right. And on that point, I do want to see what your experience as an undergrad was, because obviously that plays a huge role in if we're going to go to grad school, and what kind of relationships we build with professors, and
definitely
developing our interests in general.
Right. Yeah. Undergrad for me was a big kind of learning experience. I had just spent over 3 years in Europe, had been out of school for quite a long time, and thought, I can kind of educate myself as I go along the way. But I reached that point where I said, okay, I need to get back into university and get some more formal education. And so like I mentioned, when I entered undergrad, linguistics was one of the courses I took. I also still at that time had a really, really strong interest in just creative writing, so very not science at all. And so I took some classes on short story fiction writing, and had kept this travel journal throughout my journeys in Europe, but could have maybe gone in that direction and pursued a career as a writer. But like I mentioned, it really was this pivotal moment where my first semester there, I took a class. It was called biological psychology. My mentor, the professor who later became my mentor, Dr. Martin Shapiro, he was really the one who opened my eyes to the whole world of the brain and the biological systems that support human behavior and all these various behaviors, not just language, but also, why do we feel hungry or thirsty, or how does reproduction work and reproductive behavior work? How does drug addiction work? All those sorts of things at a biological level. So that class really grabbed my attention, and as an undergraduate, I just went up to the professor one day and said, hey, I heard you do some research I'd be interested in getting involved with that, just curious about it. And yeah, that's what started that kind of moment of my eventual trajectory to what I'm doing now.
Right. So obviously you built a connection towards that professor's type of research, and yeah, I mean, like, that's huge, right? And especially for going to grad school. And now, like, in transitioning to grad school, what was that like for you, that transition? What did you learn about yourself?
Right, yeah. That was another big turning point for me in my academic career, graduate school. So working under Dr. Shapiro at Fresno State as an undergrad, he really encouraged me to go to graduate school. I didn't really have any idea what it was. Again, first generation college student.
Yeah.
I had no idea. My dad's highest education was, I think, the 4th grade. My mom completed high school, but that was about it. And so, but they always encouraged me to succeed, do as best you can. Yeah. If you don't want to work on the dairy the rest of your life, milking cows, then you should probably do something else. And that was a big motivation for me and my siblings to pursue higher degrees.
Yeah.
And so, graduate school, I should say first, leading up to graduate school, I was studying an undergrad human time perception, which sounds kind of interesting on the face, but can be extremely boring. And I ended up not continuing on that path. But I was more into what would be considered cognitive psychology. We used an electroencephalogram, so it made it a little more biological. And that's just one of those devices there's little electrodes that you put on your scalp, and it can kind of pick up brain activity. And we were trying to correlate that activity with how people perceive short intervals of time. But I will say one of the mistakes, well, I don't know if I should call it a mistake, but one of the choices I made that really affected my graduate school direction is I completed my undergrad degree very quickly. I think I was only there for a total of 2 years, and that made me a much less competitive applicant. Even though my GPA was great, I had this research experience. When I went out to apply, I didn't have the time to really develop my research interests and the real kind of concrete experiences that they look for in graduate school, especially a graduate degree in psychology. If you're pursuing a research degree, they want to see that you've been going to conferences, presenting posters. Especially students these days are getting publications, which is something was unheard of before. So the competition was much higher, and I applied to, I think, almost 20 different programs and got accepted into a few. And this was another moment where I think kind of random chance sent me on this path toward more biological neuroscience. At that time, I was going with my strength, which was this electrophysiology, putting electrodes on a human scalp. I didn't realize that electrophysiology actually encompasses a much broader field of study. And where I ended up going, UC Riverside, was an electrophysiology lab, but it was working with brain tissue from rodents and collecting electrical recordings directly from the brain. So that was kind of what pushed me toward going into graduate school in that program, and eventually my final career as a neuroscientist. So, well, I won't say final, but my current career. There's a lot of options out there. But yeah, so that was kind of how I went about it. I must make another plug for my undergraduate degree as a McNair scholar. I think that also helped kind of make me aware of the different options that were out there for graduate programs, and gave me a better idea of what to expect.
Right. Yeah, I know we've heard of McNair, but for those that don't know, what exactly does McNair do?
Sure. So essentially they're a program set up at undergraduate institutions to promote students who are underrepresented in higher education to get a Ph.D., basically. So as an undergrad, you have like a cohort of other undergrads. You're all working in your individual labs with research mentors. There's some funding to help pay for some of that research. And then they give you all these workshops on how to, design your CV and how to write a syllabus for a class and how to design a good PowerPoint presentation, GRE prep, which is another, kind of block that makes it hard for a lot of people to get into good graduate programs. So yeah, it offers those services for people who students who are underrepresented. And so me being this first generation student, I fit into that category. And they were extremely helpful. And then you also have this kind of cohort of people, you're all going through similar things and learning about graduate school for the first time. It's like something you'd never really thought about. So that was helpful as well, just to be around people who are kind of similar to you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
important tools to have, especially if you're considering grad school or a Ph.D.
Definitely.
And, like now going into your research, I'm wondering what were like the big ahas in your research? What some of the things that have really stood out to you?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think a lot of, I'm still an early career stage. I don't necessarily aspire to some great aha moments in my research. There's a funny graphic you can find online that it shows I think a picture of a circle, and there's a little bump on one side of the circle, very tiny, and there's an arrow pointing at that bump, and it says something like, this is your cumulative dissertation for your PhD in terms of your contribution to the bigger world of science. Science is very much a slow process. It is something that can be really frustrating actually for students, graduate students, especially when you're pursuing a research degree, and may explain why a lot of people prefer to go more applied, clinical maybe routes. When you're working directly with people and their problems, and you have pretty immediate satisfaction of the effect you're having on them. But for a research degree, I wouldn't say anything I've accomplished is really a big aha moment. It's very incremental little steps that tell us, okay, there's a little bit more in this pathway that may be involved in, my graduate work, which was memory. So how are memories formed? And so in graduate school, I worked with how memories are incorporated into the brain, particularly this area called the prefrontal cortex. It's right in the front of your brain, and a very specific genetic process that happens called epigenetics, which essentially is how your DNA can be kind of modified, or access to your DNA can be modified. And so is that an aha thing? I don't know. It was, I guess, exciting at the time, but I think a lot of researchers encounter this, where you try to explain your research and it's like the people you're talking to don't really see the importance of it. And it can be hard when you're not making these huge discoveries. I'm not going to cure, cancer or anything like that. I won't cure drug addiction, but maybe me alongside thousands of other researchers, each making these kind of incremental and often repetitive experiments so that we know we're doing it right. That whole scientific method, you want to make sure that the data you're seeing is accurate. That together maybe we can make progress in putting a dent in treatment for drug addiction. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I can point to one study that I did where it was I made a huge step forward.
Yeah, but I think that's the reality of things, right? Most researchers, I don't think most are going to be having these big, huge discoveries, that maybe we hear about in the news or right. Like you said, it's the small incremental changes.
Yeah. And part of that involves how media interprets science. There's all these different processes involved, and oftentimes science is kind of taken out of context, and they sent was it John Kelly, I think, who the astronaut who spent the longest time in space, and his twin brother stayed on planet Earth, and they did this kind of study to see what were the changes on his body after he came back from, I think it was 360 some days in space. And immediately the media grabbed onto that and said, "Space changes your DNA." This guy went up to space, and he had an identical twin, and he came back, and they were no longer identical twins. And of course, like, that's not what the science said at all, but it makes a good headline, right?
Yeah,
and
for
it
sure.
captures people's attention, which I understand. But yeah, communicating science, that's like a whole nother ball game. Important for all researchers to learn those skills. But yeah, it can be tricky.
Yeah. And what do you think some frustrations are in doing the work that you do, that you've come across, or colleagues,
Right, yeah. So probably directly related to that is we're not having these big like aha moments where we put in tons and tons of time, and oftentimes the experiments go wrong, or you get very unexpected results, or the results are unclear. That is probably the greatest source of frustration when you're pursuing a research degree or a research-based career. Yeah, it's hard, and you have to kind of adjust your expectations and really try to frame why do you show up every day and spend 14 hours handling rodents and putting them in cages and taking them out, cleaning up poop and all that. Like, what is the purpose of this?
Yeah.
But yeah, when you reframe it and think like, yeah, I am kind of adding a little bit to this whole process of science, and maybe that's satisfying. But yeah, I'd say that is probably one of the bigger frustrations. And some of the people you work with, I mean, I think it's like any other job.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, you can have jerks for bosses. And
Yeah, you gotta deal with people.
Yeah.
That's how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Is there maybe like one study that you've been a part of that you can talk about, or that really stands out to you, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I've been involved in a lot of different research. I'd say the one I'm kind of excited about right now is a study I worked on during my postdoc. So that's a period of time after I got my Ph.D. where I worked at a university basically as a researcher, no longer a student. And this is up at UC Santa Barbara. And this is when I really started to get into drug addiction work. And so the study I kind of helped out on was related to how hormones affect behavior. So how do particularly gonadal steroids, so things like estrogen, testosterone, things that are produced by the human gonads, and we know that these things cross over into the brain. Are they impacting behavior in any important ways? And research says, yes, there is an effect. There are receptors in the brain that respond to things like estrogen, and they're directly involved in circuitry that is related to reward-seeking behavior or motivated behavior. And so the study we did, we wanted to see the effect of estrogen on drug-taking behavior. And so in a nutshell, we had animals that were castrated or overreactomized so that they didn't have any endogenous hormones being produced, and then we would give them injections of the hormone every day. In this case, it's estradiol. It's just a metabolite of estrogen. And so we looked at the effect of these estradiol treatments on whether animals would seek out a drug like cocaine, or whether they would prefer a more natural reward like food. And so the animals would have a choice. They could press a lever to get either cocaine or press a lever for food. And we see in this study that there's a shift in behavior. The animals that receive those hormone injections, the estradiol treatment, tend to prefer cocaine more than food. So then you have to ask, well, why is that?
Right.
What is happening in the brain that could shift that behavior? Well, one factor is we know that estradiol can act as like an appetite suppressant. That exposure to estrogen will decrease the reward value of food in and of itself. So we've seen that in other studies. But what we really want to understand is biologically at that circuit level, when estrogen or estradiol enters the brain and interacts with receptors, how is it affecting those reward systems in such a way that cocaine becomes a preferred reward? So yeah, that was like the first study I was kind of involved in. And for me, it was a great start to try to understand a lot of these differences that for the longest time people have ignored.
Right.
Most research, if you look at science as a continuum since it began, people have been not very interested in what happens in the female brain or body. Most animal work ignores females because, well, one reason is because they're more complicated. They have different levels of estrogen at different times, and so that's just more work for researchers to do. Whereas if you just take a male animal, they don't have to worry about that as much. So, but it really has meant that a lot of these effects that we see are only male animals, or even in human work, it's a lot of research done on white males, right? And we don't know how that translates into other populations.
Right.
So that generalizability factor is really, really important. And so fortunately, a lot of the science community realizes this has been a problem, and so they're pushing people to go in these directions. And for me, it was a great experiment to do, to kind of introduce me to that whole world.
Right. Yeah, one of the articles that you sent us, I read the one on sex differences in drug use. And something that was fascinating to me was that women, I guess, they developed drug addicting behaviors at a much faster rate than males were. That was interesting to me. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's something that even anecdotally we don't notice that as much, but when you look at the actual numbers, you do see these differences, these sex-specific differences.
Right, and like you said, it's because women produce estrogen at different levels at different times.
Right. So
it depends, right?
So that's certainly a factor, right? That's one factor we can look at and say, oh yeah, this is definitely how females and males differ. Although I should say testosterone, which is the predominant male gonadal steroid, when it breaks down in the body, it also breaks down into estradiol as one of its metabolites. But men in general have much lower levels of this, and the levels are pretty consistent throughout a certain period of time, whereas females have this kind of predictable cycle. But of course, there are lots of other factors that are involved, especially when you start looking at humans, because human societies and whether people seek drug treatment is one thing. So maybe it could be that more women go and seek treatment for drug addiction versus men who they think, oh, I can solve my own problems. I don't need to be treated for anything.
Right.
Lots of other factors that could play into these. But the fact is that there is a difference there. And from my perspective, I'd like to see what are the biological factors that could be supporting this, and how can we try to understand those to better treat people who suffer from addiction.
Right. So I was going to go into asking about the implications of this in terms of males and females, and like you said, being able to develop better treatments. And
Right. Yeah. So that's a big thing. We know that there's a huge epidemic, right? And especially with opioids, it's a growing concern. And there are plenty of treatment facilities out there, but are they offering, the best treatment? I saw a report recently about how a lot of these treatment facilities seem to be more money-making operations. And so there's so many other factors that play into the epidemic that we currently see. But yeah, from my perspective as a scientist, I want to be able to explain, well, what exactly is happening in the brain during this addiction cycle, during relapse, during withdrawal, and in understanding that process, can we find pivotal areas to introduce treatments and specific treatments that might help. So I just got back from a conference in San Diego, and one of the big topics there was talking about using other non-therapeutic drugs as potential treatments for addiction. And one example is cannabis. So we know that cannabis has lots of these different substances that make up the whole cannabis plant, and whether those can be used in some combination to help treat things like opioid addiction. In one of the reports I saw, they talked about how cannabidiol, which is CBD, it's one of the compounds that is commonly found in cannabis, seems to interact with the receptors that respond to pain. They're called nociceptors. And in combination with an analgesic like if you're taking something like fentanyl for back pain or something, that using CBD actually lowers the amount of fentanyl you need to use to feel pain relief. And so can we use that as a potential combinatorial drug that can decrease the amount of opioid that's being used, which we know the more opioid you use, the more likely you are to become addicted to it, and therefore help address this kind of epidemic. So, but since cannabis is still considered, a federally banned substance, a lot of the funding agencies at the federal level don't want to support that kind of work. So I don't know. Hopefully something changes. But
a lot of politics behind that.
Right.
Yeah.
Another example was a researcher looking at psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, as a way to treat nicotine addiction, I think.
Right.
But yeah, so there's lots of creative ways we're trying to find to treat these things. But from my perspective, I'm really a basic scientist. I want to understand how the neurobiology supports these kinds of behaviors and get down into the details of proteins and circuitry and how is the brain wired in such a way to help promote things like reward seeking, which in turn can lead to drug addiction. But yeah.
Yeah. I've always wondered just why do a lot of researchers like to use mice or rats? Why is that always the go-to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there are a few different answers to that question. One is that they are much less expensive than other animals.
Right.
Like primates, for example, can be really expensive. They breed a lot faster, so you can have multiple generations in a short time span. They're much easier to work with, I would say, than humans, for example. Humans can be a pain to work with. It's hard to keep people that will stick to a regimen or something like that. You don't, especially with a lot of these self-report studies. A human participant goes home and has to fill out some survey or something, and who knows what they're doing at the same time, whether they're paying attention. Mm-hmm. With the rodent, you control basically every aspect of their environment, and now, especially with mice, you can also control every aspect of their genetics. And that's something that just isn't possible with humans. It's unethical, first of all, to do that to a human. And our ethics are a little more blurred when it comes to smaller rodents. And yeah, I would say that's kind of the big reason, is that we can really dissect out specific parts of the biology on a rodent that you just can't do in a human.
Right.
So yeah, they're powerful models, and a lot of the therapeutic drugs that people use every day now were based off of findings in rodents or non-human animals. So we owe a lot to them, actually.
Yeah, we do.
But yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask now, what brought you to Dominguez Hills?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, I'm a product of the Cal State system, and during my postdoc, when I went on the job market, I noticed there were a few different Cal States looking for a biological psychologist, which I can kind of fit into that category. Dominguez Hills for me was a really special place. When I interviewed here, I have to admit, I didn't know it existed before I applied. I think I had heard of it at some point,
It's a pretty small Cal
it's
State.
a much smaller Cal State, and that is one of the reasons I actually like it a lot. It's much smaller. I feel like the interactions with students here seem to be, to me, much more meaningful. And this is me coming from the UC system. UC Riverside, great school, and they do a good job serving underrepresented students. UC Santa Barbara, also a fantastic school. They're getting there with their underrepresented population. I think they just recently qualified as a Hispanic Serving Institute. But yeah, Dominguez Hills, I mean, you're really in the heart of it, right? We're in South Central LA, and predominantly students coming here have a very different background from what you see at the UC, for example, or even at their Cal States. So yeah, when I first interviewed here and talked to other faculty and the students and get an idea of what to expect from a career here, it really impressed me. One of my colleagues told me, he said, I've taught at a lot of different Cal States as an adjunct professor, and the students here really stand out in terms of just being extremely grateful for the time that their professors are lending to them to help them learn and better their lives. The students are really well motivated, and oftentimes that's based on their own life circumstances. It's very different to pursue a degree when your parents are paying for everything and you live on the beach and stuff, versus when you're working a job and you're raising children and you just need to get to that next step that will help better your life. So yeah, I find the students here tend to be very grateful and motivated to do the work that you ask of them. Much less entitlement than I've experienced at other institutions. And I think the primary reason is I saw a spot for me to fit in and bring something new to this campus. Other campuses have developed neuroscience programs or biological psychology. Here, not so much. There's maybe one other researcher, faculty here who works on neuroscience type questions, but my goal, I've only been here for 2 years, but my goal is to help really expand that out and hopefully bring in more students who are interested in studying the brain and more faculty who are going to pursue that and really try to develop a type of center or consortium of people who are interested in the brain and how it impacts lots of different things, not just drug addiction, but the brain's involved in everything we do. So yeah, that's kind of the direction I'm going now.
Yeah.
And a big reason why I chose to come here.
And in getting these students interested in something like your field, did you come across any frustrations in that aspect, or limitations, or any challenges?
Definitely some infrastructural limitations that exist here. One is that because there hasn't really been anyone here who works with neurobiology, the curriculum doesn't exist for it. So most students come here and they've had no exposure to things like what is a neuron, what is a synapse. Very, very few courses that actually cover those things. So that's one hurdle that I'm currently overcoming. I'm adding a lot of new courses to the catalog and plan to help teach a lot of those. So yeah, that's the first strategy, is get students, especially when they first come in here, to take these classes and start to understand, okay, what is the brain, and is this something I would be interested in learning more about? That's one hurdle. Another hurdle has just been on the research side. Again, because it's a smaller campus and they haven't had a lot of people doing my type of research, the facilities don't really exist for housing someone who works with small rodents. So that's another thing that I've made a lot of progress on, and fortunately well supported by the administration here. They're working with me to develop that. And so, yeah, it's kind of working from the ground up, but that's something I've always done. I did it as an undergrad. In the first lab I worked in, there was just some old EEG equipment sitting in a closet somewhere, and no one knew how to use it. And so that was my project, was working with my mentor to develop this lab. And then my graduate work, again, a new faculty who wanted to do different techniques, and so he put me on a project to develop this part of the lab that studies epigenetics and rodent behavior and memory. So I'm kind of used to it, and find it kind of satisfying, and it also puts me in a position to have a lot of control of where things go.
Right.
Versus, when you enter a system that's already well developed, you're just kind of another cog in there, and you're providing, an essential service, but you're just, filling a space for their bigger scheme.
Right.
Here I get to be the puppet master. I create the bigger scheme.
Yeah, you're kind of leading the way here.
Yeah. So it's always been kind of my way to do it, and I like it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I don't know if you have any questions, but I also wanted to ask, with undergrads, I feel like for me personally, maybe he can attest to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
There is like this not knowing of what grad school is, or what do I want to get into specifically? How do I just go about it?
Right.
What kind of advice could you give to maybe someone who's going to graduate in undergrad and is looking for grad school, or and something specifically like psychology?
Right. Yeah. So the first thing you would need to ask yourself is, am I interested in being a clinician, which is, working with people, maybe as a therapist or something like that, social worker, much more applied side of psychology, or am I more interested in being a researcher, scientist? So that will help kind of tell you what type of grad school you should go to, either a more like applied clinical degree or a more research-based like a Ph.D. Although there are clinical programs in Ph.D. as well.
Right.
But once you figured that out, the first thing, just based on my own life experience, is as soon as possible connect with a professor who's doing research that you're interested in, and try to be available to participate in that process. Because as most grad programs, when they get these applications, they want to see a student who they know has already kind of experienced some of what grad school is going to be like. Because
Right.
you have to imagine a PhD program can be anywhere from 5 to 8 years, depends, some are much longer. And they want to make sure they're investing in a student who's going to stick through it and knows what they're getting themselves into. And you don't necessarily have to be, the highest GPA or the smartest kid in the class, but showing that you can stick through something and you persevere, because grad school's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. You get paid very little, which sucks. You have a very demanding schedule. You often work with people who expect a lot of you and may not be sympathetic to your whole life history. So it's hard. And I'd say especially for students who don't really have the role models that have gone through this before, right? You have no expectation there. You have your whole life experience, which is harder to translate into something like graduate school.
Right.
Just being prepared for that and knowing what to expect. Really, the sooner you figure out whether graduate school is for you or not, which I don't think it's for everyone. I think there are probably too many people who go to graduate school because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to do with their lives, and they're like, oh, it's just like going to school again. I'll kick the can down the road. And honestly, I fell into that camp a little bit as well. I knew I was interested in these things, but I didn't know exactly what type of job I wanted or anything.
Right.
Graduate school traditionally has been to train researchers and, or at least doctoral programs, the future faculty and professors, people who are going to teach and do research. Now it's starting to shift where you can get into PhD programs that really help train you for things outside of academia. And I think that's a good thing. But you really have to know what you're getting yourself into before. The next piece of advice I would offer is, once you identify the programs you want to apply to, really single out those professors who you think you would want to work with. Contact them as soon as possible. See if you can just talk to them about their work. Ask them, what do they do, and how maybe try to picture yourself working with this person. A lot of students, I think, make a mistake in focusing on a graduate mentor that is working on something that they've always dreamed they want to work on, right? Like if I want to I want to cure Alzheimer's, I'm going to work in this lab because he's the best Alzheimer's scientist. I don't think that's the right way to approach it. I think you should approach grad school as very much a training experience. And so in that, you won't necessarily work on something that you are terribly interested in. You should still have some kind of basic level interest.
Right.
But what's more important, I think, is working with people that you know you can work with. And there's all sorts of variety of types of advisors and mentors, and some are more hands-on and they're always there, and some are never there and they let you be independent. And so you have to really figure out like what works best for you. Do you need someone there who's going to help train you and really walk you through step by step, but also that means they're going to be watching everything you do, maybe micromanaging a little bit? Or do you prefer more of the hands-off approach where you kind of develop things yourself and you
Right.
learn on your own, and you can maybe go to this person for help every so often, but they're not always going to be there. Lots of different mentoring styles. So once you've identified people you want to work with, try to really figure out which one has the style that would work best with you and your personality type. So.
Yeah, that's solid advice, because I think it's what you said, where a lot of us think, oh, this is the best one in this field, like I want to work with this person. But we don't think of personalities are going to connect, work style, that sort of thing. It's important.
Yeah. You really want to be in an environment because it's hard, and
Right.
even if you're doing something that you absolutely love, it's hard to motivate yourself to keep at it for 5 to 8 years.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure you're in an environment that's supportive of you. It will be challenging regardless, but you want to identify those people that you think you can work well with, and don't worry too much about the specifics of the overall research question. You're really there to learn how to be a researcher. So you'll learn some techniques. If you're doing a neuroscience degree, you'll learn very basic kind of neuroscience laboratory techniques. You also learn things like how to write a paper and how to present your research, how to manage a team of people, how to train others. All of those things are actually really important skills that you can then translate to other professions, not necessarily just become a professor, but also maybe go work for an industry, biopharmaceutical company or something like that. In my field, there's a lot of different opportunities out there, and so you have to really see it as a training experience. You're going to train and learn these skills, and then you'll go off and apply them to different careers and find out what career really works best for you.
That's awesome.
How would you recommend like a student find out like whether or not you would work well with a professor? Just because sometimes it might be unclear because you might not have that much time to talk with them.
Right. Yeah.
How is that process?
It can be hard, especially because a lot of most professors are kind and friendly on the surface, and you don't really know how they are to work with.
Yeah.
So, if at all possible, I would recommend talking to students in their lab currently, which they're also going to give you maybe half the whole story, right? Because they're still working with this guy.
Right.
And students who have graduated from his lab or from their lab. Those students, they may be still tied to the faculty a little bit. They may need letters of recommendation or whatever, but I feel like they're more pivotal in being honest and tell you about things. You can also try to look at just how productive are they? You can look at their publication record and see, is this someone who is really active in the lab and is publishing all the time, or is he someone that sits on a pile of data and doesn't publish for 10 years,
Right.
And that's not going to be good for you. So you can get some of those metrics. I really wish there was like a Yelp or something like that for mentors, for academic mentors, because it would be nice to have kind of anonymous feedback on how someone did as a mentor.
Yeah.
Because that's, it's unfortunate, but when you go through a graduate program, you don't really get specific skills training on how to mentor other people. And you see that. I saw that clearly in a lot of the professors I interacted with. It's like, okay, you may be a great teacher or a brilliant scientist, but
Right.
you have no clue on like how to work with individuals on a project and how to guide students and support them so that they become their own independent researchers. So that's something that's really lacking. And yeah, it can be hard to figure it out, but if you're persistent and you try to read between the lines, a lot of times you can tell whether this is someone you want to work with. And it's, it's easier to separate out, the jerk professors versus the friendly ones. I think what's harder is to figure out like, okay, what is their style exactly? Is this someone that's gonna, well, first you have to identify what style works best for me. Do I want someone there all the time, kind of micromanaging, but also guiding, supporting me? And then try to figure out, what is their style. And often students will be honest about, mentoring styles because it's not as negative sounding.
Right. Yeah. Important. How are we in time-wise?
Yeah.
Lose track
Couple
of time.
minutes.
Yeah, a couple minutes. Well, one of the last questions we like to ask our interviewees is, what are you most grateful for right now in your life?
That's a good question. Yeah, and it's actually, I feel like being reminded of that is really important if you want to succeed as a graduate student, as an academic, or really probably as a human being. It's really important to look back at, what got you to where you are, and who to be grateful for, appreciative. Yeah, I don't know. I've had a lot of good mentors, I will say, throughout my life. First and foremost, my family. I connect very well with them, and I'm fortunate to be the last born of seven brothers.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
I've had 6 older mentors throughout my whole life who have all gone through everything that life has to offer. So certainly very grateful for them, and they continue to act as my advisors. Yeah, and then non-relatives, various academic advisors, and a lot of that I would recommend other people do this as well, is try to identify life mentors, people who can kind of help you, guide you through certain aspects of life. And my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Martin Shapiro, he was pivotal in me pursuing this career. So very grateful for that. Definitely throughout graduate school and the trials and tribulations, that having a cohort of graduate student friends who all kind of support each other, commiserate, and maybe over a beer you can complain about all the problems of graduate school, but that really is helpful in surviving that environment. Yeah. Who else? So many people to be grateful for. Yeah, just the friends and people who've been in my life for a long time and really helped support me through a lot of the hard stuff. My daughter, I guess, is another definitely motivating factor for me to be successful. So being appreciative is really important. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day stressors, especially when you're going through something like graduate school. So I would say it's just as important to remember who got you to where you are now, especially for students who are underrepresented. It's hard to find those mentors, people who look like you, that are your professors, people who look like you that are really successful. And so show that appreciation for those that step up and help guide you through it, because it's really important.
It's people that have been behind you all the way, every time, right?
Exactly.
Cool. And I guess maybe the last question. What do you look forward to the most in the future here?
Oh man,
in the near future?
I am really excited about developing a neuroscience program at this campus, and so I really look forward to bringing together this kind of interdisciplinary program. It doesn't have to be necessarily just neuroscience, but anything that can involve, how the brain is operating and supporting human behavior, or I've talked to a lot of my colleagues who are interested in how literature impacts the brain, or the literature that exists around how we define what the mind is, or like the philosophical side of things. Looking at the anthropological evolution of the brain. I'm excited about really building a team of faculty and students that can kind of come together and talk about these really big ideas. I mean, the brain is is the most complex organ in our body, probably the most complex thing in the universe. And understanding it is no simple task, but there's so many different ways you can approach it. And so for me, I'm excited about kind of putting together this cooperative team that's going to work together and discuss these bigger issues and hopefully, learn something from it.
Yeah, awesome, man.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any last minute?
No, thank you so much for.
Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, of course. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, maybe we'll have to do it again soon.
I could talk about a lot of different things, but certainly happy to share my experiences.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back.
Yeah, please do.
Awesome.
Yeah, next time you should look at my history in brewing, because I definitely have a lot of experience with that as well. So
we're kind of a beer lover ourselves.
Okay. I was a little surprised it didn't come up this time, but that's I do have some notoriety in that field. So
awesome, man.
Yeah.
Cool.
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Philip.
Yeah,
Pleasure,
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.